The ground trembled beneath my feet as the HOA president stormed onto my property, her eyes full of fire. "You think you can fight me?" she sneered, slamming a legal notice into my hands. "I own this town, and I'll bury you under the weight of these rules." I felt my heart race as I stared her down, the tension thick in the air. She wasn't just coming after my land. She was coming for everything, and I wasn't about to let her win. The battle had begun, and this time, I wasn't backing down. Will I survive her wrath, or will she crush everything I've worked for? Stay tuned, because this fight is far from over. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping my morning coffee when the mail arrived. It wasn't unusual for a few letters to show up at the door, but this one stood out. A bright red envelope, embossed with a bold, urgent stamped across the front. My heart skipped a beat as I tore it open, not knowing yet how much this simple letter would change everything. The letter was from the HOA. I had heard about their rules before, the fines, the strange regulations about how you could park your car or where you could hang a flag. But nothing could have prepared me for what was inside this one. "Dear property owner," it began, "this letter serves as official notice from the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association. Due to recent assessments, your property is in direct violation of several HOA guidelines. As per Section 4B of the community rules, your land, including the water access, is subject to our oversight. Effective immediately, all recreational use of your 3,600-acre lake ranch is prohibited unless proper consent is granted by the HOA." I blinked. This couldn't be real. I had inherited this land from my father, who had worked tirelessly to turn it into a peaceful retreat. There were no signs anywhere of the HOA's jurisdiction reaching that far. They were claiming the entire lake. My heart raced as I read the rest of the letter, each line more absurd than the last. "The HOA has also identified several unpermitted structures on your land, including but not limited to the boathouse and dock. Immediate action is required. Failure to comply within 14 days will result in a fine of $50,000 and potential legal action." $50,000? For what? For living in my own house on my own property? I set the letter down, my hands trembling slightly. How did they have the authority to control my property like this? I had no intention of backing down. This wasn't just about property rights anymore. This was about principle, standing up against this overreach that had gone too far. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. How dare they? What gave Karen, the HOA president, the right to even think about imposing such outlandish demands on me? I remembered the few times I'd run into her at the community meetings. A woman in her early 40s, dressed in what I can only describe as corporate power casual. She had that air about her, as if her word was the law, and everyone else was just meant to follow along. She acted like she was in control of everything, from the color of your mailbox to the height of your grass. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't someone who cowered to authority. My father had built this property from the ground up. He had worked with every inch of land, and he passed that work, that pride, onto me. If she thought she could just waltz in and take it from me without a fight, she was wrong. I immediately called a lawyer. I needed to know what my rights were. As I waited for the call to connect, I felt my thoughts racing. I'd been through fights before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just some random dispute over a noise complaint or an unfair tax. They were coming after my entire way of life, and I wasn't going to let that happen. The lawyer answered, and after explaining the situation, he was as shocked as I was. He assured me that we would fight this, but he warned me that it wasn't going to be easy. The HOA had deep pockets and an agenda, and Karen wasn't going to back down easily. Still, he gave me some hope, telling me that if I had the right evidence, we could hold them accountable. As the conversation ended, I felt a mix of relief and dread. I had to be smart about this. No impulsive decisions, no emotional reactions. I needed to gather evidence, plan every move, and outsmart them at their own game. Karen might have been used to intimidating people, but she wasn't going to intimidate me. Not this time. But I knew I couldn't take this on alone. I had to find out more about this HOA, the people behind it, and their dirty tricks. And I needed to make sure I wasn't the only one standing up against them. It wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about something bigger. The rights of homeowners like me. The rights of anyone who had ever been pushed around by people in power. The real fight had only just begun. I couldn't help but wonder, if I backed down now, would it ever stop? Would they just move on to the next person, the next vulnerable piece of land they could control? I wasn't going to let that happen. But as I stared down at that letter, I knew this was just the beginning of a much bigger battle. Stay tuned, because what happened next would change everything. Would you stand up to an HOA that threatened to take your property? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to follow this journey. Trust me, it's just getting started. The ranch had always been more than just a piece of land to me. It was a symbol of my father's hard work, his dreams, and his stubborn dedication to carving something meaningful out of the rugged terrain. I can still remember the first time I stepped foot on it. Just a boy back then, my dad showing me how to ride horses, how to work the land, how to appreciate the stillness of the lake in the early morning light. It wasn't just about the work. It was the connection, the feeling that you were part of something bigger. The sprawling 3,600-acre lake ranch was the place where we could breathe, where we were free from the noise and demands of the world. My father had built it from nothing. I watched him pour his soul into the place. I'd grown up there, learning not just how to ride and fish, but how to respect the land, its history, and its beauty. When he passed away a few years ago, I inherited it all. It was a bittersweet moment. Having the land was a gift, but it was a reminder of the hole he left behind. I didn't immediately know what to do with it. I'd been living in the city for years, focusing on my career. But after Dad passed, I decided to move back, to reconnect with the land. I thought it would be a peaceful place to spend my later years. A place to rest, reflect, and continue the legacy my father had worked so hard to build. I had plans, simple ones. I would maintain the property, keep it running, maybe even open it up for guided fishing trips and weekend getaways. Nothing fancy, just a way to preserve Dad's vision and share this little slice of heaven with others who could appreciate it. But I also knew the lake and its surrounding acreage were special, unique, even, and I wanted to protect it from the growing urban sprawl that had started creeping into the area. That's when I started hearing about the HOA, the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association. At first, it was just whispers from neighbors, a vague mention of a community group that was supposed to keep things running smoothly around here. I didn't think much of it. After all, I owned the land. This was my home, my ranch, my sanctuary. Karen, the president of the HOA, wasn't much better in person than her reputation. She had that air about her, the one that says, "I'm in charge here, whether you like it or not." She'd first approached me during a community meeting a few months after I'd moved back, introducing herself in a way that made it clear she thought she was running the entire area. The first time I met her, she was polite, but there was an underlying tone of condescension in her voice. The kind of tone that made it clear she saw me as just another landowner to manage, another piece of property to control. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Reynolds," she'd said with that forced smile. "We've heard a lot about your place. Quite the estate you've got there. Must be nice to have all that land." I wasn't sure what she meant by that last comment, but I let it slide. After all, I was new to the area. I figured she was just being friendly, maybe trying to make small talk. But over time, I started noticing little things, the way she would drop by with suggestions for improvements. The way she'd talk about the HOA's guidelines, subtly hinting that I was expected to follow them if I wanted to stay in the community's good graces. I dismissed it at first. It was clear she had a tendency to think highly of herself and the HOA's influence. But I didn't feel like I needed to follow rules that didn't apply to me. My ranch wasn't part of any community development. It was self-sustaining, independent. Or so I thought. The tension between us started to build. At first, it was small things, comments about the way I maintained the lakefront property or how often I had guests over. Little, passive-aggressive remarks about the way the ranch looked, about the boats I kept docked there, or the type of trees I was planting. In the beginning, I didn't mind much. I figured she was just being a stickler for the rules, and after all, the ranch was my father's legacy. I wasn't about to let some HOA president tell me what to do with it. But things escalated. Karen's tone shifted from passive-aggressive to downright authoritative. I received a letter, a formal notice, about unapproved structures on the property, things like the old boathouse my father had built and the dock that jutted out into the lake. According to the HOA, these were violations of community standards, and I was required to either tear them down or bring them up to their approved specifications. That was when I began to see what the HOA was really about. It wasn't about the lake or the trees. It wasn't about maintaining order in the neighborhood. It was about control. and it was clear that Karen thought she had the right to decide how I lived, what I built, and how I used my own property. I tried to brush it off at first, but when I received another letter, this one threatening fines if I didn't comply with their demands, I knew it was time to act. I wasn't about to let someone like Karen take my father's dream away, especially when the dream was never meant to be owned by anyone but me. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. The HOA wasn't just going to try to take down my boathouse. They were about to go for something far more valuable and far more dangerous. And I couldn't help but wonder, how far was Karen willing to push this? Would she stop at the boathouse, or was she just getting started? The answer, I'd soon find out, would change everything. But for now, I had to prepare for what was coming. The battle over my land was just getting started. It was a warm, early afternoon when Karen showed up unannounced. I had just finished a long morning of clearing out some fallen branches near the dock and was ready to grab a drink and relax for a bit. I was leaning against the porch railing, enjoying the quiet sounds of nature, when I saw her drive up the gravel road in her shiny black SUV. She wasn't just visiting. I could tell this was business. She parked, stepped out with that air of certainty she always had, the kind that made people feel like they were in the presence of someone who controlled things. I watched her walk toward the house, her heels clicking with each step as if she owned the place, like she was already 1 foot in the door of my world. I wasn't in the mood for a confrontation, but I knew it was coming. I couldn't avoid her forever. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, offering that perfect, practiced smile. "I hope you've had a chance to review the letters I sent." She didn't wait for an answer, walking right past me and onto the porch, as though she was invited. I took a deep breath, letting the calm of the lake soothe my nerves for a second. I had been expecting this, another meeting where she would try to push her agenda, but I wasn't going to let her steamroll me. Not this time. "I've read them, Karen," I said evenly. "And I'm not sure what part of my property the HOA thinks it has authority over, but I haven't seen anything that suggests you have any right to interfere here." She didn't flinch. If anything, her smile widened, like she was enjoying this. "Oh, I know. It's confusing at first. You see, the HOA has very specific rules, and it's our job to ensure those rules are followed. That includes," she glanced down at her clipboard, "modifying structures that might affect the neighborhood's aesthetic and safety. Your dock, for example, doesn't meet the HOA standards. It's a safety hazard, and we've had complaints about it." I felt a rush of anger, but I stayed calm. "This is my property. I'm not running a community here, and I don't need your approval for how I maintain it. Your HOA can't tell me what to do on my own land." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained as smooth as ever. "You might think that now, Mr. Reynolds, but you'll come to understand that this is for the greater good. We have rules for a reason. You're not just representing yourself. You're part of this community. And what happens here affects us all." She paused, letting the words sink in. "You see, if everyone just did whatever they wanted, it would cause chaos. I'm just trying to maintain order." I took another breath, my patience stretching thin. "I don't want any part of your order. I have no interest in following your arbitrary rules about how I run my property. I'm not asking you for permission to do anything, and I won't." She looked at me, the smile still on her face, but there was something behind it, something more calculating. "You'll have to think carefully about that, Mr. Reynolds. If you choose to ignore the HOA's rules, you might find yourself facing more than just fines. Legal action is a very real possibility, and believe me, the HOA has the resources to take that route." "Legal action?" I was stunned, and a knot twisted in my stomach. "You can't be serious. You're threatening to take me to court over a dock." My voice betrayed a flicker of disbelief, but I quickly reined it back in. "You can't control what I do with my own land. You don't have that kind of authority." She held her ground, her expression unchanging, but there was a sharpness in her eyes now, a cold, unsettling resolve. "You'd be surprised what the HOA can do. It's not just about docks or boathouses. It's about community standards, Mr. Reynolds. We are here to make sure everything is maintained properly. If you fight this, you'll be on the losing side. You won't want to see what happens when we take this to the next level." I wasn't about to back down. "I've been living here for years without any of your rules, and I'll continue living here without them." She stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to make it feel like a personal threat. "You might think you're safe now, but I can promise you, the HOA doesn't just let things slide. This is about the bigger picture. You're either going to play by the rules, or there will be consequences. We don't lose, Mr. Reynolds. We never lose. My heart beat a little faster, but I stood tall, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. Well, Karen, I guess we'll find out who's right, won't we? I said, the words coming out more forcefully than I intended. She gave a small, almost smug smile. We will. With that, she turned and walked back toward her car without another word. Her heels clicked against the wood with the same certainty as before, but something about the way she walked, without turning around, without flinching, told me she thought she had already won. I watched her drive off, the dust settling behind her SUV. For a moment, I stood on the porch, unsure of how to feel. Was this really happening? Was she really going to take me to court over a dock? I didn't know yet how deep this went, but I was about to find out. I wasn't about to let her or the HOA push me off my land. But I knew that this was only the beginning. And whatever Karen had planned, I had a feeling it was going to get a lot worse before it got better. As I stood there, the weight of the situation slowly started to settle in. How far was I willing to go to protect what was mine? Would the HOA keep pushing until they had everything, or would they learn they couldn't take me down that easily? I wasn't sure yet, but I was about to find out. The battle had begun, and it wasn't going to end without a fight. It didn't take long for the next letter to arrive. This time, the envelope wasn't just marked urgent. It had a thick, official-looking seal on it that practically screamed, "You're in trouble." I stared at the letter on the kitchen counter, my coffee cup forgotten in my hand. The air felt heavier now, as if the walls were closing in on me. I opened it slowly, already bracing myself for what was coming. "Dear Mr. Reynolds," it began, "we are writing to inform you that the HOA has conducted a further review of your property and found additional violations, including but not limited to unauthorized structures, unsanctioned water usage, and failure to comply with community guidelines regarding the shoreline. Immediate action is required, or we will be forced to issue a fine of $100,000 and seek legal action." I dropped the letter. The fine was now more than double the amount they had threatened before. It felt like a punch to the gut. I stood there, frozen, the weight of the words pressing down on me. The shoreline? Unauthorized water usage? I had no idea what they were talking about. I had lived on this land for years, and my father had maintained it long before me. There was nothing here that wasn't in line with basic property law, and now they were accusing me of violating rules that didn't even exist as far as I could tell. This wasn't just about a boathouse anymore. This was about everything. The next few days were a blur of frustration. The HOA continued to send more letters, each one more demanding than the last. They were now calling for immediate compliance with their guidelines on everything from the landscaping around the lake to the materials I used to build my dock. One letter even claimed that my fishing boats were posing a threat to wildlife and demanded that they be moved off the water. It was absurd. Each letter seemed to escalate in tone, the threats more blatant. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just a power play, a bluff to see if I'd fold under pressure. But it didn't feel like a bluff anymore. They were serious, and it felt like I was being suffocated by their demands. I couldn't just sit here and take it. But what choice did I have? I didn't want to start a war, but I couldn't just roll over either. Every letter, every new fine, felt like a new battlefront opening up, one I hadn't asked for. This wasn't just a matter of a nuisance anymore. They were coming for everything I had. One evening, as I was sitting at the kitchen table with yet another letter from the HOA in front of me, I heard a knock on the door. I opened it to find my neighbor, Henry, standing there. He was a quiet, older guy, been living in the area longer than I had. We didn't talk much, but we'd shared a few beers at neighborhood barbecues. "You okay, John?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I was caught off guard. "Yeah, just dealing with the HOA." "What?" Henry glanced around, as if making sure no one could hear him. "I got one of those letters, too." He pulled out an envelope from his coat pocket. "They're after me for my shed. Said it's too big, too close to the property line. You'd think they'd just want us all to get along, huh?" I felt a knot in my stomach. I'd known the HOA was bad, but hearing it from someone else, someone who was also caught in their crosshairs, made it real in a way I hadn't anticipated. Henry was a good guy, a man who just wanted to live his life in peace, like me. "This is getting ridiculous," I said, running a hand through my hair. "They're trying to force me to tear down everything. My dock, my boathouse, even the trees near the shore. It's like they want control over every inch of land." I'm not sure what's next. If I don't comply, they'll take me to court. Henry nodded grimly. Same here. They told me the fine would go up to $50,000 if I didn't tear down that shed. I don't even know what to do anymore. It was clear he was just as trapped as I was. But that moment, standing in my doorway, something clicked for me. If we were going to survive this, we had to fight back, together. You've got a lawyer, right? I asked. He shook his head. I can't afford it. I'm not sure what good it'll do anyway. I've heard of people who hired lawyers and still lost. The HOA's got a lot of power. I could see the defeat in his eyes, but I refused to let myself feel that way. I couldn't afford to. If I was going to stand up to Karen and her HOA, I had to be calm, calculated, strategic. I couldn't let the frustration get the best of me. I'm hiring a lawyer, I said, the words more to myself than to him. And I'm not backing down. Henry looked relieved, like he needed someone else to say it, someone else to take charge. I'd be glad to join in if you've got a plan. Let's see what we can do. I replied, my voice steady. We'll start digging into this. I've got a feeling we're not the only ones dealing with this. Maybe we can make this a bigger issue, get the community behind us. As Henry left, I went back to the table, the weight of the letters still pressing down on me. The threat of legal action was real, and I could feel the strain creeping into my bones. But there was something else there too. A fire starting to burn. They thought they could intimidate me into submission. But I wasn't just going to back down. I needed to find out who else in this town had been silenced by Karen's HOA. I needed evidence, support, and every legal weapon I could find. If this battle was going to be long, it was going to be one I fought with patience, precision, and persistence. The next phase of this fight wasn't just about standing my ground anymore. It was about turning the tables. And Karen would find out, sooner rather than later, that she had picked the wrong person to mess with. But for now, I had to prepare. The next few weeks were going to be critical. The days after Henry left were some of the longest of my life. Each morning, I would wake up early, make my coffee, and sit at the kitchen table, staring at the piles of letters and notices from the HOA. They kept coming. More fines, more demands. Every single one was a reminder that this wasn't going away. I had to take action. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed a lawyer, someone who could look at this objectively, someone who could find a way out of this mess. I wasn't a lawyer. I didn't know how to navigate these complicated documents and laws. But I did know one thing. I wasn't going to let Karen and her HOA take my father's land from me without a fight. I spent the next few days researching local attorneys. I called around, but nothing felt right until I spoke with a man named James Calloway. He'd handled property disputes before, and from the moment I described my situation, he seemed to understand exactly what I was up against. Mr. Reynolds, he said when we first spoke, his voice calm but authoritative. The HOA's claims are not only questionable, but their tactics are borderline harassment. We can fight this, but it's going to take time and preparation. The best thing you can do right now is start documenting everything. Every letter, every phone call, every email. We need to build a case. His words were a relief, but also a reminder of the mountain I was about to climb. Still, hearing a lawyer say we had a chance made all the difference. James told me he would need to review the HOA's documents, and in the meantime, I needed to focus on gathering evidence. That's when I started to feel like I had some control. I walked around the property, taking photos of everything. My dock, the boathouse, the shoreline, and even the trees that Karen had complained about. I wanted to capture everything, just in case she tried to argue it wasn't up to code. I documented the state of everything. The boathouse was sturdy, well-maintained, nothing out of place. I knew Karen was hoping I'd overlook something, but I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. I even made a list of every person I could think of who might be able to help. Henry was one of the first people I reached out to. I was glad I had talked to him, and it turned out he was just as frustrated with the HOA as I was. It felt good to have an ally, even if it was just a neighbor. He wasn't rich or influential, but he knew a lot of the other homeowners around the lake who had also been dealing with Karen's antics. I asked him to start talking to people, to see if there was anyone else who had been pushed to the breaking point like I had. I also started reviewing the HOA's own rules. I'd gotten a copy of their bylaws from the local community center, and as I skimmed through them, it became more and more clear to me just how far they were overreaching. Their regulations were vague, inconsistent, and full of loopholes that they could easily exploit for their own benefit. But I wasn't about to let them use those against me. One afternoon, I sat down at my desk with a stack of legal papers, a notepad, and a cup of coffee. I was getting the hang of this, underlining sections of the HOA documents that seemed contradictory, writing down notes about their vague language, and cross-referencing that with property law. My mind started clicking, the pieces falling into place. I wasn't just taking notes anymore. I was crafting my defense. It was strange, though. There were moments when the weight of what I was doing hit me. I'd stop, staring at the piles of paperwork, and wonder how much longer I could keep this up. Karen wasn't going to just give up, and I knew I was in for a fight. It wasn't just the money. I had the emotional cost to think about, too. The ranch wasn't just a piece of property to me. It was a place filled with memories, my father's dreams, and the hope of continuing a legacy. I couldn't let that be taken from me. There were moments when doubt crept in. Maybe I was fighting too hard. Maybe it wasn't worth all the trouble. But then I'd remember Karen's face, her smug smile, the way she'd spoken to me like I was just another person to bulldoze. No, I wasn't going to back down. I couldn't. James Calloway finally called me back after reviewing everything. "I think we have something here," he said, his voice full of quiet confidence. "We can argue that the HOA's demands are not just overreaching, but unlawful. Their regulations are inconsistent, and I have a feeling they violated some fair property laws in their attempt to enforce these rules. If we play this right, we can not only beat them, but hold them accountable." I leaned back in my chair, letting his words sink in. This wasn't just a fight to keep my land. It was a fight to protect my rights, to stand up to an organization that thought it could do whatever it wanted. And now, it felt like I had the tools to fight back. We set a plan in motion, starting with building our case and gathering witnesses. James was already reaching out to a few people who had experienced similar harassment from the HOA. The pieces were starting to come together. But it wasn't going to be easy. I knew that. I had seen the lengths the HOA was willing to go to. They didn't just want compliance. They wanted control. And Karen was at the center of it all, pulling strings, using whatever leverage she had to intimidate people. I couldn't let that happen. With every phone call, every letter, every legal document I reviewed, I felt the weight of the battle ahead. But I also felt something else, something that was growing stronger by the day. Confidence. I was ready. The time for action was coming. But just as I felt that small flicker of hope, a new letter arrived. And this one changed everything. I didn't know it yet, but Karen had just made her biggest mistake. The day of the meeting felt like the calm before a storm. I woke up earlier than usual, the weight of the upcoming confrontation already pressing down on me. The coffee wasn't as comforting as it usually was. I sat at the kitchen table, papers scattered in front of me, my notes, the stack of legal documents, and everything I had gathered so far. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind 1,000 times, but now, as the time for action drew closer, the reality of it all felt heavier than I anticipated. Today was the day. The HOA had called a meeting with all the key players, and Karen had insisted that I attend. The gathering was set to take place at the community center, but I had a feeling this wasn't going to be a typical HOA meeting. I wasn't walking in there to shake hands and play nice. I was walking in there to take a stand, to make sure Karen knew I wasn't backing down. I arrived early, giving myself a few minutes to calm my nerves before I went inside. The community center was a small, plain building, but today, it felt like the weight of the world was inside with me. I could already see a few people gathering outside, chatting in groups. A handful of neighbors, all seemingly loyal to the HOA, standing around in their perfect little bubble. I wasn't sure how many of them would actually support me in this fight, but I wasn't going to count on anyone. This battle was mine to fight. I walked inside, scanning the room. It was packed. The usual suspects from the HOA were sitting at the front, and there, of course, was Karen. She was seated at the center of the table, her arms crossed in front of her, looking as if she had already won. Her eyes met mine for just a second, and she offered a smile that felt more like a smirk. "Mr. Reynolds," she greeted me, her voice dripping with that same practiced sweetness. "Glad you could join us today. We have some important matters to discuss." I didn't respond right away. I wasn't here to get pulled into her games. I nodded in acknowledgement, found my seat, and spread out the papers in front of me. My lawyer, James, had told me to stay calm, stick to the facts, and not let Karen derail the conversation. So, that's exactly what I was going to do. The meeting started with Karen laying out a few basic items, mostly housekeeping, a few community updates, the usual minutiae of HOA business. I was half listening, waiting for the right moment to speak. It wasn't until she finally got to the point that I had been dreading, the topic of my property, that the tension in the room started to grow. "Now, Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice taking on that tone again, the one that made it clear she thought she was the authority. "We've discussed the various violations on your property. The dock, the boathouse, the unapproved shoreline modifications. We've given you ample time to comply with the rules, but you've made it clear that you have no intention of doing so. We're here to make sure that the community standards are upheld." I could feel the eyes of the room on me. Most of them had that look of mild disinterest, except for a few who seemed curious about what was about to happen. The same old HOA members who sat at these meetings like they were guarding the gates of some kingdom. "I've made my position clear from the beginning," I said, my voice steady but firm. "This is my land. The docks, the boathouse, and the shoreline. Everything is in line with property law. Your demands are not only unreasonable, they're illegal. I've already contacted my lawyer." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Karen's smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "Your lawyer?" She let out a small, humorless laugh. "Mr. Reynolds, I've been doing this for years. You can bring all the lawyers you want, but the HOA has all the resources and support it needs to prevail. This is about the community, not your personal interests." I leaned forward, my calm demeanor barely hiding the frustration I was beginning to feel. "This is not about your community, Karen. This is about control. You've crossed a line. I will not be intimidated into complying with your demands, especially when they don't hold up legally." Her expression soured. "I'm not here to play games, Mr. Reynolds. You'll either comply with the community standards, or we'll take legal action. We don't lose." I sat back in my chair, letting her words hang in the air for a moment. "You can threaten me all you want, Karen, but the law doesn't work the way you think it does. You don't get to just make up rules and impose them on people because you don't like the way they live." I could see the shift in her. The perfect smile cracked, and the veneer of confidence started to slip. She was used to being in control, and I had just taken that control away from her. She wasn't used to being challenged like this. "Fine," she said, her voice low and tight. "We'll see how long you hold out. But don't think we won't follow through. You're not the first person to fight us, and you won't be the last. But we always win in the end." I nodded slowly, maintaining eye contact. "We'll see about that." As the meeting continued, it felt like Karen was trying to regain the upper hand, but the cracks were already showing. She was trying to maintain her usual air of superiority, but it was clear that she wasn't as confident as she had been before. Each time I stood my ground, she lost a little bit of that control. The tension was palpable as the meeting wound down. I knew Karen wouldn't back down, but I wasn't backing down either. This wasn't just a fight for my property. It was a fight for my dignity, for my right to live without being harassed by people who thought they could control me. As the meeting adjourned, Karen shot me one last look. It wasn't a look of triumph. It was a look of uncertainty. I knew this wasn't over, but I also knew one thing. This was only the beginning of her realizing that I wasn't going to be an easy target. And in the back of my mind, something else was taking shape. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was going to make sure that Karen and her HOA learned a very important lesson. I wasn't the one who had to prove anything. They did. The battle wasn't over, but with each move I made, I could feel the power shifting in my favor. And I knew this. When the next confrontation came, I'd be ready. It didn't take long for Karen to strike back. It wasn't just the continued letters. It wasn't even the fines that kept piling up. No, Karen was more subtle than that, more insidious. She knew she couldn't break me with paperwork alone, so she started playing a different game. The first signs of retaliation came when I noticed a few local news stories cropping up, stories about property disputes in the neighborhood. At first, it was nothing too specific. The headlines were vague, the sources unnamed. But as I dug deeper, it became clear. Karen had orchestrated a quiet smear campaign. Neighbors who had never been involved were suddenly talking about my refusal to comply with HOA guidelines. The local paper picked up on the story, running an article about a rogue landowner refusing to be part of the community. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. People I had known for years were now whispering behind my back, calling me the troublemaker or the one who was holding up progress. I'd been to a few community gatherings, shared a few drinks with these people, and now they were acting like I was the enemy. But I wasn't going to let it shake me. Karen wanted to turn my name into mud, to isolate me, to make me feel small. It was a classic tactic. If you can't win with the law, you go after someone's reputation. But what she didn't know was that I'd seen this coming. I had already been gathering evidence, documenting every incident, every piece of communication, and now I needed to do something with it. The next blow came through legal channels. I received another letter, this time more formal, more threatening. It wasn't just about fines anymore. It wasn't about docks or boathouses. It was about everything. Karen and the HOA were now accusing me of endangering the neighborhood's safety and well-being. They had involved the county, claiming I was violating zoning laws, pollution laws, anything they could throw at me. The letter stated that if I didn't comply within 30 days, I would face more than just financial penalties. The HOA, backed by what seemed to be the full force of the community's legal apparatus, was now threatening a full-blown lawsuit, one that could cost me everything. If they won, I could lose the ranch, the land that had been in my family for generations. But I wasn't about to let this ruin me. The anger that had been simmering inside me for weeks finally reached a boiling point. I felt the weight of it all, this relentless assault on my home, my father's legacy, and my rights. But I knew that responding with anger wouldn't solve anything. I needed to be calm. I needed to be precise. I called James, my lawyer, and filled him in on the latest developments. This is escalating fast, I told him, trying to keep my voice steady. She's not just going after the property anymore. She's attacking my reputation and trying to bankrupt me. I'm at my breaking point, James. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not surprised, he said finally. This is a classic move. They're trying to wear you down, push you into submission. But this isn't just about fighting them in court anymore. This is about showing them you're not backing down. I nodded, though he couldn't see me. What's the next step? We need to hit back. I'm going to request all their records, every document, every email, every communication they've had with you. We'll find something that shows this isn't just about community standards. It's about power. And once we expose that, Karen won't be able to use her position like she has been. I felt a little relief after that. There was a way out. James knew what to do. But Karen didn't give up easily. As the days passed, the smear campaign started to take its toll. More and more people in the community started to turn away. Neighbors I had once spoken to began avoiding eye contact, crossing the street when they saw me walking toward them. Even people I'd been friendly with at the local store would avert their gaze and pretend they didn't see me. I was starting to feel isolated, alone in this fight. It was exactly what Karen wanted. She was hoping I would get frustrated, that I would make a mistake, anything to give her an advantage. Then came the biggest blow of all. One afternoon, I found a notice tacked to my front door. It was from the county sheriff's office. They were demanding that I attend a hearing about the safety concerns raised by the HOA. The hearing was scheduled for next week. At first, I was stunned. They had managed to involve the sheriff's office? Karen was taking this to another level. The thought of a public hearing, with everyone watching, made my stomach churn. I could almost hear her in my mind, whispering to the sheriff's office, pushing for more action against me. But I wasn't going to let her control the narrative. I wasn't going to be painted as the villain. Not now, not ever. I took a deep breath, the weight of it all settling over me. But there was something else too, something that had been growing stronger inside me over the past few weeks. Resolve. The more they threw at me, the more determined I became to fight back. This was about more than just a piece of land. This was about standing up to an unjust system, to a person who thought she could dictate how I lived. I wasn't going to let Karen or the HOA win. This was the turning point, the moment where I either gave up or pushed back harder than I ever had before. The upcoming hearing wasn't just a formality anymore. It was the next battlefield, and I was ready to show Karen that her little games wouldn't work. But as I read the notice one more time, something told me that this was only the beginning. Something bigger was coming, something I couldn't see yet. And I had a feeling that the next few days were going to change everything. I wasn't backing down. And Karen would learn the hard way that I wasn't someone she could easily crush. The hearing was approaching fast. I had spent the last few days preparing, gathering evidence, reviewing legal documents, and strategizing with James. I could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on me, but at the same time, I started to sense a shift. The more I worked, the clearer it became that I was on the verge of turning the tables. I had the law on my side, and the more I uncovered, the more I realized how much power the HOA had overstepped. It wasn't just the paper trail that was stacking up. It was the cracks I started to notice in Karen's carefully constructed facade. Every letter, every threat, every meeting she had orchestrated. She was acting out of desperation. And that gave me an edge. She thought she was in control, but I was starting to see her weaknesses. James had a breakthrough in the case. He uncovered something critical. The HOA's zoning claims about my land didn't hold water. The legal definitions they were using for community standards were vague and didn't apply to my property at all. It was a loophole, a gaping one. James said it could be the key to turning the whole case around. I could prove that the HOA was misapplying laws, that they were twisting the community guidelines to suit their own agenda. I remember the exact moment when the shift began. I was sitting at my desk, poring over the documents James had sent over. The phone rang, and when I answered, it was him. "John, you're going to like this. The county's own records contradict everything the HOA's been saying. The zoning laws they're using against you, they don't apply. We've got them now." I took a deep breath. "Are you sure?" I asked, trying not to let my voice tremble with excitement. "Absolutely. I've already filed the preliminary motion to dismiss based on the zoning violations. We've got the legal ground to challenge their entire case," he replied. I could feel the tide turning. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to Karen's moves. I was making the moves. I was in control, but I knew this wasn't over yet. I still had to face Karen in court, and she wouldn't go down without a fight. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and strategy sessions with James. We had a strong case now, but Karen wasn't going to back off. Her next move came when I least expected it. The HOA fired back with a counterclaim, accusing me of interfering with community harmony and continuing to violate their rules. They also threatened to escalate the issue to the local news outlets, hoping to turn the community against me. The smear campaign wasn't just in the papers anymore. It was everywhere, online, in social media groups, in private messages between neighbors. Karen was using her position to stoke the flames of distrust. I wasn't worried about the public opinion anymore. I had my evidence. And Karen, despite all her threats, was starting to reveal her true character. Every move she made, every legal threat she sent, made her more desperate. The more she tried to control the narrative, the more she exposed the cracks in her authority. Then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I got a call from James one afternoon. "John, you need to prepare yourself. Karen's pulling out all the stops now. She's not just relying on the HOA's position anymore. She's hired a top-tier attorney to go after your property directly." I sat up straight, the blood draining from my face. What does that mean? It means she's not messing around anymore. They're going for a full court battle, and it's going to be ugly. We'll need to counteract, but we've got a good chance with the zoning angle. I hung up the phone, my thoughts racing. Karen was doubling down, pulling out every legal weapon she had, but I wasn't going to let her win. I had to stay focused. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a test of patience, strategy, and resilience. I had already come this far, and I wasn't going to stop now. As the day of the hearing loomed closer, I began to feel the full weight of what was at stake. My father's land, my family's legacy, everything I had worked for was on the line. But I also knew something else. This wasn't just about the land. It was about standing up to someone who thought they could push others around, someone who believed they had the right to control everything. Karen had made a mistake when she underestimated me. I had the law on my side. I had the evidence. And now, more than ever, I was determined to see this through to the end. The hearing arrived faster than I expected. The courtroom was packed with spectators, Karen's supporters, people who had bought into her narrative. But I was ready. I walked in, calm but focused, knowing that every decision I made today would move me one step closer to winning. I took my seat, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. And then I saw her, Karen, sitting across the room with her new lawyer, looking at me like she had already won. But I wasn't the same man I was when I first walked into this battle. I had prepared, I had studied, and now it was time to show her what I was capable of. The hearing began, and as the lawyers presented their arguments, I sat back, letting the tide of the case turn in my favor. James laid out the zoning violations in clear, undeniable terms. Karen's case started to unravel piece by piece, and I could see the frustration building in her eyes. As the hearing drew to a close, I knew the next few days were crucial. I had turned the tide, but Karen wasn't done yet. She would fight back, no doubt, but this time, she was fighting from a position of weakness. And as the judge prepared to give his ruling, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, I felt like we were finally on the winning side. But then again, I knew that Karen's next move would be coming soon. And when it did, I would be ready. There was one more move to make, and it would change everything. The court date had arrived, and everything seemed to be falling into place. The evidence was clear, the law was on my side, and James was confident we were going to win. Karen's arrogant smile had started to fade as the case unfolded, and I could feel the tide of the battle shifting in my favor. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unexpected was coming. We were nearing the end of the hearing, and Karen's lawyer was wrapping up his argument. He had been pushing hard, but every claim he made seemed weaker than the last. I sat back, trying to maintain my calm exterior, but I could feel the anticipation building inside me. I knew we had them cornered. The moment we had been waiting for was almost here. Then, just as the judge was about to ask for final statements, the courtroom door opened. I turned, expecting to see a bailiff or another lawyer entering with a document. But instead, it was a man I recognized immediately, a man I hadn't seen in years. It was Frank Walker, a former member of the HOA who had quietly resigned years ago after a bitter dispute with Karen. He'd been one of her biggest supporters at one time, but after some personal disagreements, he had quietly faded into the background. No one had heard from him for ages. Frank stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the crowd before locking onto Karen. He was holding a folder, his expression unreadable. Karen froze, her face draining of color as soon as she saw him. I could see it, the flicker of panic in her eyes that she was trying to suppress. But it was too late. The room had already noticed the tension between them. Frank approached the judge's bench and leaned down, whispering something into the judge's ear. The judge nodded, and then Frank turned toward the courtroom, his eyes now fixed on Karen. "Your Honor," Frank began, his voice steady but firm. "I need to present evidence that may change the course of this case." I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. What was he doing here? Why was he speaking out now, after all this time? The judge gestured for him to proceed, and Frank opened the folder he was holding, pulling out a series of documents. My heart began to race as I watched him lay them out on the table in front of him. "These are copies of internal HOA communications from the last 2 years, Frank said, his voice cutting through the silence. They detail several meetings where Karen and the board members discussed deliberately circumventing the community's guidelines to target specific property owners. Mr. Reynolds' property was one of their main targets. The room went completely still. Even Karen seemed unable to respond, her face pale as she realized what was happening. Frank's voice grew stronger as he continued, his words now striking with the force of a blow. "These documents contain clear evidence that the HOA has been manipulating regulations and using their position to intimidate and pressure homeowners into compliance, regardless of legality. I also have correspondence between Karen and several legal advisors discussing tactics to pressure landowners into selling their property." I could feel the shockwave of what Frank was saying ripple through the room. The judge looked over at Karen, his eyes narrowing. "Is this true, Ms. Keller?" the judge asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Karen's face twisted, and for a moment, I thought she might lose control entirely. But she quickly regained her composure, standing up with an air of defiance. "This is a lie," she snapped. "Frank Walker is disgruntled. He's trying to ruin me because of his personal grudge. None of this is real." But Frank wasn't backing down. He remained calm, his eyes unwavering as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to stop the HOA from abusing its power and to expose the truth. I have evidence. Emails, meeting minutes, recorded conversations, everything that proves Karen's abuse of authority. I've kept these documents for a reason, and now I'm offering them to the court." The tension in the room was unbearable. The judge didn't respond immediately, but I could see his eyes flicking from the papers to Karen, then back to Frank. Karen was visibly rattled, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to maintain her confident facade. I knew this was the twist I'd been waiting for. Frank had been the last person I'd expected to help, but here he was, dropping the bombshell that could destroy Karen's case. The evidence he had was undeniable. This wasn't just a legal loophole anymore. This was a full-scale revelation of corruption and manipulation within the HOA. I sat there, absorbing the gravity of it all. For the first time since this whole battle began, I felt a surge of hope. But I knew better than to let my guard down. The fight wasn't over. This revelation had shifted the balance of power, but Karen wasn't going to just admit defeat. She would retaliate, of course. She would try to explain away the evidence, or worse, accuse Frank of fabricating everything. The judge stood up, holding the documents in his hands, and looked directly at Karen. "Miss Keller, you have some explaining to do," he said, his tone firm. "I suggest you prepare for a thorough investigation. This court will be postponing the case for a review of these new developments." I could feel the weight of the moment. Frank's intervention had turned the tide in my favor, but it had also intensified the stakes. Karen was now backed into a corner, and I knew she'd stop at nothing to regain control. As the judge called for a recess, Karen shot me one last glare. It was a look of pure venom, but it was also tinged with something else, a sense of fear. She knew now that she wasn't in control anymore. The real battle was about to begin. And this time, Karen was the one on the defensive. But as I stood up to leave, a thought lingered in the back of my mind. Frank's help was a blessing, but would it be enough to finish this? Or was there something else lurking that I hadn't yet uncovered? The twist had come. But now, I had to make sure Karen didn't find a way to turn the tables again. The next move was mine. The day of the final hearing arrived like the inevitable collision of two forces. I could feel the weight of it the moment I woke up. This was it, the moment everything would either come crashing down or fall into place. There was no more room for mistakes, no more waiting for the right evidence to show up. It was all on the table now. I could tell from the start that Karen was rattled. She was acting a bit more defensive than usual, even though she tried to hide it behind a well-practiced smile. But the tightness around her eyes, the way she kept straightening her papers, told me everything I needed to know. She knew she was walking a fine line. This was the final showdown, and neither of us was going to give in without a fight. The courtroom felt more intense than ever. The walls seemed to close in as the judge took his seat, the audience silent, waiting for the proceedings to begin. I could hear the soft rustling of papers, the faint click of heels on the polished floor as Karen's attorney moved around the room, setting up his case. Karen herself sat across from me, her posture perfect, her face a mask of determination. But I wasn't fooled. Her facade was cracking, and I could feel the power shifting. We had already presented our case. My lawyer James had laid out everything so carefully. The zoning violations, the illegal tactics, the documents Frank had revealed. But now, as Karen's lawyer began to speak, I could feel the tension rising. He was trying to salvage what little was left of their argument, but it was clear that they were grasping at straws. "This case is about more than just one man's property rights," Karen's lawyer began, trying to sound confident. "It's about the integrity of the community, the standards we've worked so hard to establish. Mr. Reynolds has repeatedly refused to comply with the HOA's lawful requests, and now his actions are endangering the entire neighborhood's safety and well-being. If we allow him to continue his defiance, what message does that send?" The judge listened attentively, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that told me he wasn't buying it. And then, it was my turn. My heart raced as I stood up, but I didn't let the nerves get the better of me. This was the moment that would decide everything. I walked to the front of the courtroom, papers in hand, and I could feel all eyes on me. I could hear the whispers from the back of the room, the subtle exchange of glances. It felt like the weight of the world was on my shoulders, but I had prepared for this. I was ready. "I've listened to the arguments," I began, my voice calm but firm, "and I've seen what has been presented here today. But I want to make one thing perfectly clear. This case isn't about community standards. It's not about safety or about protecting the neighborhood. This case is about power. It's about one woman's obsession with controlling others and using the HOA as a weapon to do so." I paused for a moment, letting my words sink in. I could see Karen's face tighten as I spoke, and I knew I had struck a nerve. Karen Keller has been using the HOA to impose her own vision of order, a vision that conveniently puts her in charge of every decision. She's manipulated the rules, twisted them, and bent them to suit her agenda. She's used her position as HOA president to harass homeowners, to dictate what they can and cannot do with their own property. And she's not just targeting me, she's targeting everyone who dares to stand in her way. I glanced briefly at the judge, watching his reaction as he took in my words. I could feel the power shifting, but it wasn't over yet. I wasn't just making accusations. I was about to hit them with something they didn't expect. I pulled out a few key documents from the folder I had been carrying. These are copies of emails, internal communications, and meeting minutes from the HOA. They show exactly what Karen has been doing behind closed doors, how she's used the HOA to target specific landowners, including myself, and force them into submission. I handed the documents to the judge, watching as he flipped through them. The room was still, the only sound the rustling of paper. Karen's lawyer was visibly taken aback, trying to process what was happening, but it was too late. The evidence was already in front of the judge, and there was no denying it. I don't need to explain any further, I said, my voice steady. The law is clear. The HOA has no right to enforce rules that don't exist. They can't impose arbitrary fines, and they can't target people based on personal vendettas. Karen Keller doesn't get to decide who lives and who doesn't. She doesn't get to control my property. The silence in the room was suffocating. Even Karen, who had been so confident before, was now visibly rattled. She didn't say a word as the judge took his time reviewing the evidence. I could feel her glare from across the room, but it didn't matter anymore. She had lost the moral high ground, and now it was a matter of time before the legal case crumbled as well. After what felt like an eternity, the judge cleared his throat. I've reviewed the evidence presented, and I believe there is a significant issue with how the HOA has conducted itself. The documents you've presented, Mr. Reynolds, are concerning. We will be postponing this hearing for a more in-depth review of the claims and counterclaims made by both parties. The words echoed in my mind. This wasn't just a small victory. It was a turning point. Karen's attempts to control me had backfired, and now she was facing an investigation. The judge had made it clear that the HOA's actions were not as legitimate as Karen had hoped. The tide had fully turned. But as I stood there, taking in the weight of the moment, I couldn't ignore the feeling that this battle wasn't over. Karen would fight back, of that I was sure. But for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. She had overplayed her hand, and now she was exposed. I left the courtroom with a sense of triumph, but I knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new phase. Karen would try to salvage what was left, but I had already laid the groundwork for my next move. And when the time came, I would be ready. For now, I had won. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the final confrontation was still ahead. One last moment where everything would be decided. And that moment was fast approaching. The day after the hearing, I found myself standing at the edge of the lake, the early morning light dancing on the water. The sounds of nature filled the air, the rustling leaves, the distant call of a bird, the soft lapping of the water against the shore. It was the kind of peace I had been fighting for, the kind I'd almost lost. The past few months had felt like a whirlwind, an endless cycle of meetings, threats, legal battles, and sleepless nights. I had poured everything into this fight, not just for my land, but for something bigger, for the principle that no one, not even an HOA president with a vendetta, had the right to dictate my life. I wasn't just fighting for a piece of property. I was fighting for my dignity, my father's legacy, and my right to live without fear of being bullied or manipulated. And now, as I stood here on the ranch that had been in my family for generations, I realized something important. I had won. It wasn't over yet. Karen still had her claws in the HOA, and there were still a few more hurdles to clear, but I had already taken the hardest step. I had stood up. I had fought back. And I had the law on my side. The battle had been long, but in the end, it was clear who the real victor was. The hearing had gone in my favor. The judge had ruled that the HOA's claims were not only baseless, but that Karen's tactics were an abuse of power. The evidence we had gathered, Frank's testimony, the internal emails, the legal violations, had sealed her fate. In the end, Karen resigned from her position as HOA president, unable to maintain her hold over the community. The remaining HOA members were forced to undergo a review, and new, more reasonable guidelines were put in place. The pressure from the HOA had crumbled. But it wasn't just the legal victory that made this moment so meaningful. It was the personal journey I had gone through. When this all started, I was overwhelmed, just a man trying to live his life peacefully, and suddenly thrust into a battle I hadn't asked for. I hadn't known how far I'd go to protect my property, my home, my rights. But through every threat, every legal document, and every meeting, I realized something that made the struggle worth it. I had learned the true value of standing up for myself. I thought about the first time Karen had come to my door, that smirk on her face, thinking she could intimidate me into submission. She thought she was untouchable. But over time, I had learned that the only thing more powerful than intimidation was patience. I had stayed calm, I had stayed focused, and in the end, that had been my greatest weapon. I had found strength in places I hadn't expected. Frank, the former HOA member who had once been an ally of Karen's, had become an unlikely source of support. He had risked his own reputation to expose the corruption within the HOA. Without his help, Karen might have still been running the show. But it wasn't just Frank's testimony that won the case. It was the collective effort of everyone who had suffered at the hands of the HOA, and those who had finally had enough. I thought about Henry too, my neighbor, who had helped me connect with others who were also frustrated by the HOA's tactics. Without his encouragement, I might have never reached out to the people who had been silenced for so long. In the end, it wasn't just my fight. It was a fight for everyone who had been afraid to speak up. And we had all won together. As I stood there by the lake, I realized that victory wasn't just about the outcome. It was about the process, the fight, and the growth that came with it. I had learned that resilience wasn't just about being tough. It was about being strategic, patient, and knowing when to stand your ground. I turned away from the lake and walked back toward the house, my steps steady and sure. The ranch was still here, still mine, still part of my family's legacy. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace about it. But as I stepped inside, the weight of what we had accomplished began to settle in. The fight had been long, but it had been worth it. Karen had lost, but there was something else that I couldn't shake. She wouldn't just disappear. People like her didn't take defeat lightly. I knew I had won this round, but I wasn't naive enough to think it was over. In the quiet of the evening, I sat down at the kitchen table, reflecting on everything that had happened. The final chapter of this story had been written, but I couldn't help but wonder if Karen had one last move left to make. Whatever came next, I knew I'd be ready, because I had learned that the fight wasn't over until you made it so. And this victory, this moment of peace, was hard-won. But I'd be damned if I let anyone take it from me again. So, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I asked myself the question that had been haunting me since the beginning. What's next? I had stood up to power. I had faced down an enemy with everything I had, and I had won. But what happened when the next challenge arrived? I wasn't sure, but I was ready for it. And that, for now, was enough. If you've ever faced a fight that seemed impossible, if you've ever stood up to someone who thought they could control you, I want to hear your story. Leave a comment below, share your experience, and let's keep the conversation going. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapter of this journey. Because, as always, the next battle is just around the corner.